Are you wondering how much Bitcoin you are going to need to retire? Well, in this video, I'm going to help you to figure that out. First, I'm going to calculate exactly how much money you need to retire. Then I'm going to show you a couple of ways that we can forecast the price of Bitcoin into the future. And finally, I'm going to show you how some of those forecasts get a little bit outrageous and we need to reel it back in and get real about how much Bitcoin's going to be worth. But ultimately, I want to show you how much Bitcoin you need to retire. Let's jump into my computer. And here we are. So, I'm not a financial advisor, I'm just some bloke on the internet.
The information shared in this video is for educational and entertainment purposes only and should not be considered financial advice. Always do your own research and consult a qualified financial professional before making any decisions.
But what I'm about to show you, I think, is going to be really helpful. So how much money do you need to retire? Well, the going figure at the moment is $72,000, and that is seen as a pretty common number for a lot of people. Essentially, if you're making about $90,000 US, then $72,000 is about what you'll need to retire. And a lot of financial planners use this number, but of course it varies from person to person. From there, we need to figure out exactly how much money you need to retire. So if we look at the annual income and we divide that by 4%, so this is called the 4% rule, and that's essentially a withdrawal rate. And the idea of the 4% rule is that you never run out of money, as I described in my video last week where I showed you how you can calculate how much money you'll need to retire. So maybe check that video out. I'll leave a link below if you want to figure out exactly how much you need to retire. But this number 1.8 million that a lot of people use is, for most people, going to be too much, because the reality is they'll never be able to save that much. But that's okay, because they're going to get a pension. This number doesn't take into account that. Also, they may get Social Security or potentially an inheritance, or perhaps they downsize their homes. There's lots of ways that people make money, part-time jobs, the list goes on. It's actually quite amazing how people get on in retirement. So we're using this number though to figure out how many Bitcoins that you'll need. So it's pretty conservative, what I'm about to show you, and I'm going to be conservative the whole way through. So the two best ways to forecast Bitcoin, one of them is the Power Law by Giovanni Santasati, something like that. And the third one is the Rainbow Chart by this guy called Aesop. He started it. They're quite different, and I've shown here some of the differences, but essentially Giovanni's model in theory should be a lot more accurate, but what I found is when you compare them side by side, the numbers stack up to be fairly similar. For the purposes of this video of figuring out how much Bitcoin you need to retire, I've actually taken the lower number based on these. So here's a chart of the Power Law model. It uses regression analysis, and it also uses logarithmic scales to essentially flatten out this curve that makes it such that we can draw these beautiful lines. This is 15 years of Bitcoin, and it takes us another at least 15 years into the future. And it also shows what the effect the halving cycle has. And when it reaches this upper bound, that's obviously when it's in bubble territory, and when it reaches the lower bounds is when bad things have happened to Bitcoin. But this just repeats over and over and over with each halving cycle, and I believe it'll continue to happen. Let's check out the rainbow chart. Here we go, here's the halving cycles. And to figure out exactly how much Bitcoin you need, I took the lowest price for these. So as an example, let's look at 2033, and that's roughly about here. If we look here, this green line intersects 1 million. So I've used the green line here. I haven't used this top purple line. By the same token, I haven't used the red line below. For this one, I actually started out using the yellow line, then the green line, then the blue line, and I kept dropping it at each halving cycle. And then I took the lowest value for each of these results. So this is the lowest out of those two models. And from there, we can figure out how much Bitcoin you'll need to retire. So if you want to retire in 1 year, you'll need 13 Bitcoin. In 5 years, 5 Bitcoin. 11 years, 1 Bitcoin. Now, of course, because of the halving cycle and because of the volatility of Bitcoin, give or take 3 years, right? So, you might need 13 Bitcoin, but we might not see the price you want until the next halving cycle. But essentially, 1.8 Bitcoins will be worth $1 million in 2033, which is just 11 years away. And even less if you want to retire later on. If you're a youngster, then you don't need much Bitcoin at all potentially. But there is a big caveat here, and that is because Bitcoin is limited by how much other things are worth. We can't have a Bitcoin worth more than everything else in the world. It just wouldn't make any sense. So when Michael Saylor talks about $5 million Bitcoin, I think he's actually dreaming, and I'll show you why. When Bitcoin reaches $1 million, it will be the market capitalization of gold. Now, currently, Bitcoin is kind of seen as digital gold. It's not really used as our currency. Very few people use it as a currency. They use it as a store of value. And this chart shows the market capitalization of gold and Bitcoin. And Bitcoin's only about 10% of where gold is at the moment. And so it's pretty easy, I think, to see how Bitcoin can 10x from $100,000 where it is currently to 1 million. And going back to our chart, will that happen in 11 years where it's worth $1 million? Possibly. In a moment, they'll also show you the return that you would get, the compound annual growth rate that you would get if Bitcoin is worth $1 million in 20 years, and it stacks up. So thinking about the upper bounds of Bitcoin, as the price of Bitcoin just gets higher and higher, I think we're going to essentially, as these charts show, there's going to be downward pressure. And this downward pressure is because all the assets in the world are worth these amounts here. So real estate is worth 33% of the total market capitalization of the world. 53%. Debt is 22%. Equities, roughly 20%. Gold, 3%. And Bitcoin is 0.3%. And that's the 10x there. So for Bitcoin to be the market capitalization of gold, it needs to 10x. Well, I think that's very likely. When it'll happen, it's hard to say. Certainly 20 years seems quite realistic to me. I mean, according to these charts that I just showed you, it's only 10 years away. But let's look at some of the strategies. And I think, first I just want to say, I think just having a Bitcoin only strategy is pretty dumb, because there are risks associated with anything. And even if those risks are low, the chances of Bitcoin going to zero, for example, is extremely low. It's been going for 15 years and so far it hasn't been hacked, or there hasn't been a a bug in the code that messes things up. But the reality is that if we just choose one strategy, there is always a chance that it could really mess us up. So it's always a good idea to have a balanced strategy, I believe. And if Bitcoin gets to $5 million, that essentially means that it is the market cap of the world. In other words, we're using Bitcoin as our only means of transfer of wealth. And for that to happen, a lot of bad things have happened. So I don't see $5 million Bitcoin. I mean, it is a distinct possibility. And that's why I think you should at least hold some Bitcoin, because if it goes to $5 million, it's kind of a hedge against if things really go pear-shaped in the world. But as we're tracking at the moment, for it to go to $1 million, in 10 years, your compound annual growth rate would have been 26%. In 20 years, your compound annual growth rate would have been 12.25%. And if you compare that to stocks, sure, Bitcoin's already gone up, thousands of percent. But if you compare this to the return on stocks, it's still a decent return even at these prices going forward. So in 20 years, assuming Bitcoin gets to $1 million, and yeah, that's an assumption, right? Like with everything, we have to make assumptions and figure out whether things are going to be worth it or not. And basically, yeah, that's a good return. So strategies to get there: dollar cost averaging. Dollar cost averaging is probably the best way for most people. And essentially that just means you set aside a certain amount or potentially a certain amount of Bitcoin, and you just get that every month and you just build your stack that way. Figure out how much Bitcoin you want. Maybe you are projecting that it's going to be 30% of your retirement, or 20% or 10%, and you dollar cost average to have Bitcoin as part of the picture. You can also follow the cycles. This is a lot harder to do because you have to have a lot more mental fortitude and emotional fortitude to buy the dips. But Bitcoin has a halving cycle, and it always turns into a bubble, and it always busts, and it always comes down again. Right now, we're right at this green line. We're right in the middle. So according to this, we've still got a fair way to go. By 2026, according to this, we could be up to 700,000. A more likely number, if you notice this last halving, we didn't quite get to the purple line. So if this is even coming down, it's quite easy to see 120, 140,000. I imagine it'll get to 120 or 140,000 this cycle. But of course, it could go a lot higher. But then it'll bust. And you can see it's going to come back to at least 100,000 based on this chart. So, yeah, guys. Hope you found this helpful. Thanks for watching. Please leave your likes and subscribe. Really appreciate it. Talk to you again soon. Thanks.